The day I walked into my garage and found my dead wife's art studio turned into a home gym was the day I realized my son and daughter-in-law no longer saw me as the owner of the house. They saw me as an obstacle, standing in the way of the life they wanted. What they didn't know was that within 60 days, everything about our arrangement was going to change. My name is David Mercer. I'm 63 years old, retired, widowed, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of man who solves problems without raising his voice. That afternoon, for the first time in years, I wasn't interested in solving anything. I had just returned from a 4-day fishing trip with 2 old friends. Nothing fancy. Just a cabin near the Deschutes River, weak coffee, bad fishing, and long conversations about things men only admit when they're sitting beside moving water. I pulled into the driveway expecting the same house I'd left behind. Instead, the first thing I noticed was an unfamiliar car parked where mine usually sat. I assumed they had company. My son and daughter-in-law had been living with me for a little over 2 years by then, long enough that unexpected guests were hardly unusual anymore. I grabbed my duffel bag, entered through the side garage door, and stopped cold. The studio door was wide open, not unlocked. Open. The kind of open that tells you a decision has already been made. I stood there staring into the room. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. Then the smell hit me. Fresh paint. Latex paint. The kind that comes in large buckets and covers things completely. The walls were bright white. Every painting was gone. Every sketch. Every canvas. Every trace of the woman who had spent 11 years creating beauty inside that room. My wife Margaret had been an art teacher for 27 years before retiring. After retirement, she painted every day she was physically able. Landscapes mostly. Oregon beaches, forest trails, rivers wrapped in morning fog. The walls had once been covered floor to ceiling with her work. Now they looked sterile, empty, erased. I walked farther inside. The hardwood floor was hidden beneath gray foam exercise mats. In the corner where Margaret's easel had always stood, there was a brand new treadmill. I recognized it immediately. My daughter-in-law had shown me a picture of the exact model months earlier and talked about wanting one someday. At the time, I assumed she meant for the apartment they kept claiming they would eventually move into. Apparently, someday had arrived. I stood in the middle of that room feeling something I hadn't felt since the day Margaret's oncologist gave us the diagnosis. Not grief, not anger, clarity. The kind that arrives when reality finally stops pretending to be something else. Then I heard footsteps inside the house. My daughter-in-law's voice floated from the kitchen, cheerful, excited, proud. And a few seconds later, she said the words that would make everything worse. We finally tackled the studio. We finally tackled the studio. My daughter-in-law said it with the satisfaction of someone unveiling a surprise she expected everyone to appreciate. I walked into the kitchen carrying my duffel bag and looked at her. She was standing beside the island with a cup of coffee in one hand and a smile on her face. My son sat on the couch nearby with a laptop balanced on his knees. Neither of them looked nervous. Neither of them looked guilty. That was almost worse. They genuinely believed they had done something reasonable. "Where are Margaret's paintings?" I asked. The smile on my daughter-in-law's face hesitated for half a second. Not enough to disappear, just enough to adjust. "Everything's safe," she said quickly. "We rented a storage unit. The paintings, the supplies, the easel, all of it. Nothing was thrown away." I stood there silently. Safe. It was an interesting word. People often use it when they know something else has been taken away. "The easel?" I asked. "In storage." "The unfinished painting?" "Also in storage." My son finally looked up from his laptop. "Dad, we made sure everything was protected." Protected. Another interesting word. I looked at both of them and suddenly realized neither one understood what the room had actually been. To them, it was unused space. To me, it was the last place in the world that still felt like Margaret had only stepped out for a moment. Margaret had retired from teaching 11 years before she died. The studio had been her dream. I spent an entire summer insulating the garage, installing proper lighting, building storage shelves, and putting in a north-facing window because she insisted artists preferred that light. Every nail in that room had been placed with a purpose. Every shelf had been built for her. During the final months of her illness, when walking became difficult, I carried a chair into the studio so she could continue painting. Even when cancer was taking almost everything else, it never took that room away from her. And now it was gone, replaced by exercise equipment and foam mats. I told you that room was not to be touched, I said quietly. My son looked down again. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms. It's been almost 2 years, she replied. You can't keep living like it's a memorial forever. There it was, the argument she'd probably been making for months, maybe longer. That's not your decision. Her expression hardened slightly. We were trying to help. By moving my wife's belongings into storage without asking me? You never used the room. I looked at her carefully. That's not the same thing. The kitchen grew quiet. Then my son finally spoke. Dad, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. I turned toward him slowly. For a moment, I couldn't decide whether that sentence hurt more than what had happened in the studio. Then I set my duffel bag on the floor and asked a question neither of them was prepared to answer. Exactly how long have the two of you been planning this? The question hung in the kitchen longer than either of them expected. My daughter-in-law looked away first. My son stared at the floor. That told me everything. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a well-intentioned mistake. It was a plan. A plan they had discussed, justified, and eventually carried out while I was gone. We've talked about it for a while, my daughter-in-law finally admitted. We just didn't know how to bring it up. I almost laughed. Bring it up. As though there had been a version of this conversation where she asked permission and somehow received it. So instead, you waited until I left town and did it anyway. She opened her mouth, then closed it. My son stood up from the couch. Dad, nobody was trying to hurt you. Then explain the part where you moved your mother's belongings into a storage unit. His shoulders sagged immediately. He didn't have an answer. The truth was standing in the room with us, and all three of us could see it. The difference was that only one of us seemed willing to acknowledge it. My daughter-in-law folded her arms tighter. You're focusing on the wrong thing. That sentence got my attention. Am I? Yes. The real issue is that you've been stuck ever since Margaret died. There it was. Not grief, not concern, judgment. A conclusion she had reached about my life while living inside my house. You barely go into that room, because it's my room. It's a garage. I stared at her for several seconds. A garage. 11 years of paintings. 22 months of grief. 31 years of marriage. Reduced to a garage because she wanted a treadmill. Something cold settled into place inside me. Not anger, certainty. My son finally looked up. We live here too, Dad. And there it was. The sentence that explained everything. Not the studio, not the storage unit, not the gym, everything. For 2 years and 4 months, I had convinced myself we were all sharing space. In reality, they had slowly begun believing the space belonged to them. The extra bedroom became theirs. Then the den. Then the garage. Then Margaret's studio. Every compromise had quietly become a precedent. Every silence had been interpreted as permission. My daughter-in-law nodded. Exactly. We live here too. We should have some say in how the house functions. I looked directly at her. No. The word surprised all of us. Even me. No? She repeated. No? You stay here. I live here. There's a difference. The room went silent. My son's face tightened. My daughter-in-law's expression hardened completely. The conversation had finally reached the place it was always heading. Then my son said something I never expected to hear inside my own home. We've actually looked into our rights. The moment he said it, I knew this situation was far bigger than a room, and much closer to a legal problem than a family one. We've looked into our rights. My son said it quietly, but the words landed harder than if he had shouted. For a moment, I just looked at him. This was the same boy I had taught to patch a bicycle tire in the driveway. The same man whose mother had once stayed awake all night helping him finish a science project because he had waited until the last possible moment. Now he was standing in my living room, after helping erase her studio, telling me he had researched legal rights against me in my own house. My daughter-in-law seemed almost relieved that the words were finally out. We've lived here for more than 2 years, she said. We've contributed. We've received mail here. This is our home, too. whether you want to admit that or not. I nodded slowly, not in agreement. In recognition, there are moments when a conversation stops being emotional and becomes procedural. 34 years as a civil engineer had taught me to recognize structural failure. This was one. The foundation was already cracked. Raising my voice would not repair it. I see, I said. My son blinked, as if he had expected an explosion. My daughter-in-law looked uncertain for the first time. That's all? She asked. No, I replied. That is not all, but it is enough for tonight. I walked upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and sat at the edge of the bed for several minutes before making the call. My attorney's name was Patricia Wells. She had handled my estate planning, the sale of my engineering firm, and several property matters over the past 15 years. If anyone knew how to turn chaos back into order, it was Patricia. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. The studio, the paintings, the storage unit, the treadmill, the phrase tenant rights. Patricia did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Give me 24 hours." That was all I needed to hear. The next day, I did three things. First, I drove to the storage facility where Margaret's belongings had been taken. The unit was in my daughter-in-law's name, so I couldn't enter. I simply sat in the parking lot for a while, looking at the rows of orange doors and knowing that somewhere behind one of them was my wife's unfinished Cannon Beach painting. Second, I went home and gathered records, rent payments, utility bills, grocery receipts, every number I could verify, not because I wanted revenge, but because facts have a way of clearing fog from a room. Third, I called Margaret's younger brother, Frank. He deserved to know what had happened to his sister's studio. He listened in silence until I finished. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." I looked toward the garage door from my kitchen table. "For now," I said, "I just need everyone to know the truth." The next morning, Patricia called back with a plan. Patricia called at 9:12 the next morning. That was one thing I appreciated about her. When she said 24 hours, she meant 24 hours. No vague promises, no delays, just results. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open while she walked me through the situation. The news wasn't entirely good, but it wasn't surprising either. Because my son and daughter-in-law had lived in the house for more than 2 years, received mail there, and used the address as their primary residence, Oregon law recognized certain tenant protections regardless of our informal family arrangement. Patricia explained it calmly, without emotion. Legal reality didn't care about family feelings. It cared about facts. Fortunately, facts happened to be something I understood very well. "What are my options?" I asked. "You establish everything formally," she replied. "In writing. Immediately." By noon, I had converted 2 years of frustration into a spreadsheet. Rent paid. Utilities increased. Grocery expenses. Storage costs connected to Margaret's belongings. Every number documented. Every assumption supported. Not because I expected reimbursement, because I wanted clarity. The engineer in me trusted numbers more than arguments. Later that afternoon, I met Patricia in her office. She reviewed the documents, asked a few questions, then prepared a formal notice. Not an eviction, not yet. A written notice, establishing expectations, timelines, and boundaries. The studio was included specifically. Margaret's belongings were to be returned. The room was to be restored to its previous condition. The storage costs would remain their responsibility. Most importantly, a clock would begin running. As I signed the paperwork, Patricia looked at me over her glasses. "How much flexibility do you want?" It was a fair question. My son was still my son. No legal document could change that. "Enough to be decent," I said. "Not enough to be ignored." She nodded. "That's probably the correct answer." 4 days later, the notice was formally delivered. The atmosphere inside the house changed instantly. My daughter-in-law barely spoke to me. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The illusion of a happy arrangement finally disappeared. That evening, my son knocked on the study door. He sat across from me in silence for several seconds before speaking. "Dad, don't you think this is a little extreme?" I closed the book I had been pretending to read. "You converted your mother's studio into a gym without permission." "That's not what I mean." "Then tell me what you mean." He rubbed his forehead. For the first time, he looked tired. Really tired. Not because of the notice, because reality had finally arrived. I just don't understand how things got this bad. I studied him carefully. Then I said the truth neither of us could avoid anymore. I think they got bad one small compromise at a time. He lowered his eyes immediately. Somewhere deep down, he already knew I was right. What neither of us knew yet was that the hardest conversation of all was still coming, and it wouldn't be started by him. The conversation happened 3 nights after the notice was delivered. I was sitting in my study reviewing old project photographs when my son knocked softly on the door. He stepped inside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. That alone told me something was different. He hadn't brought me coffee in months. "Can we talk?" he asked. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was heavy. Eventually, he placed his mug on the desk and stared down into it. I talked to Patricia. That surprised me. "You called my attorney?" "I called an attorney," he corrected. He explained what the notice means. I nodded. "And?" He let out a slow breath. "And he said you're within your rights." The word sounded painful coming out of his mouth, not because he disagreed, because he had hoped reality might be different. "I never wanted this to become legal," I said. Neither did I. But even as he said it, we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Someone had researched tenant rights before I ever called Patricia. Someone had been preparing for legal arguments while I was still trying to treat the situation like a family disagreement. My son leaned back and rubbed his face. "Dad, I think everything just got away from us." I looked at him for a long moment. "Did it?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he shook his head. "No." That honesty mattered, more than he probably realized. "Your wife believed she was helping," he said quietly. "She really did." "Helping whom?" I asked. He opened his mouth, then stopped, because there wasn't a good answer. Helping me would have required asking me. Helping the house would have required respecting the person who owned it. Helping Margaret's memory certainly wouldn't have involved putting her paintings into storage. "She thought you were stuck," he said. "Maybe I was." His eyes lifted slightly. "Then why are you so angry?" I looked toward the garage through the study window. Because being stuck is something a person gets to work through on their own terms. The room went silent again. Then I asked the question I'd been carrying since the day I returned from the fishing trip. "What do you think your mother would say about that studio?" The change in his expression was immediate. Not defensive, not frustrated, hurt, real hurt. For the first time since all of this began, he wasn't thinking about legal notices or housing arrangements. He was thinking about Margaret, about the woman who painted in that room every day she could stand, about the woman who sat beside his hospital bed when he broke his arm at 11, about the woman whose easel now sat inside a storage unit. He stared down at the coffee and whispered, "She'd hate it." It was the first completely honest thing he had said since this started, and it changed everything. For the first time since I returned from the fishing trip, my son stopped defending what had happened and started seeing it. Not the argument, not the legal paperwork, the actual damage. He sat quietly in the study for several minutes after mentioning his mother. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. Some truths require room to settle. Eventually, he looked up. I should have stopped it. I didn't answer right away. The statement mattered because it wasn't an excuse. It wasn't followed by a justification or an explanation. It simply existed. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He nodded slowly. "When she first brought it up, I told her it was probably a bad idea. That didn't surprise me. My son had never been cruel. His weakness was different. He avoided conflict the way some people avoid fire." "Then what happened?" I asked. He gave a tired laugh without humor. "One conversation became 10 conversations. 10 became 50. After a while, it stopped sounding unreasonable." I leaned back in my chair. That explanation made more sense than anything I'd heard so far. Major mistakes rarely arrive fully formed. They arrive one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, one surrendered boundary at a time. By the end, people barely recognize how far they've traveled. "You know what bothers me most?" I asked. He shook his head. "The gym isn't permanent. The paint can be repainted. The mats can be removed. The treadmill can be sold. He looked confused. Then what is it? The assumption. He frowned slightly. What assumption? That nobody needed to ask me. The answer seemed to hit him harder than I expected. Because that was the real issue, not the room itself. The belief that my grief had become a problem other people were entitled to solve. The belief that living in my house long enough gave them authority over parts of my life they didn't understand. My son looked down again. I never thought about it that way. I know. That was the problem. Later that week, Patricia finalized the next phase of the process. The notice established 30 days formally, but I instructed her to extend it to 60. When she asked why, I gave the same answer I'd been carrying since the beginning. Because he's still my son. The updated notice arrived that Friday. 60 days. More than enough time to find a rental if they were serious about leaving. One additional requirement remained non-negotiable. Margaret's studio had to be fully restored before they moved out. Every painting, every brush, every shelf, every piece of that room returned exactly as possible. My son accepted the terms without argument. That alone told me how much had changed. Unfortunately, not everyone in the house was ready to accept reality. 3 days later, I came downstairs for breakfast and found 2 unexpected people sitting at my kitchen table. And the look on my daughter-in-law's face told me she had just made her next move. My daughter-in-law's parents had driven 4 hours from Medford without calling, without warning, and without being invited. Her father stood when I entered the kitchen, a large man with the posture of someone used to winning conversations by occupying more space than everyone else. Her mother sat beside him with both hands folded around a coffee mug. My daughter-in-law stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching me as if this meeting had already been arranged in her favor. I poured myself coffee before saying anything. Then I looked at her father. Good morning. He did not return the greeting. We need to talk about how you're treating our daughter. I sat down at my own kitchen table. Then talk. His jaw tightened slightly. She's pregnant. That was the first I had heard of it. My son looked down immediately. My daughter-in-law looked at me as though the information should end the discussion by itself. I let the silence sit for a moment. Congratulations, I said. Her father leaned forward. You cannot push a pregnant woman out of her home. There it was, her home. The phrase arrived exactly as I expected it would. This is not her home, I said calmly. This is my home. His face hardened. She's your family. She is my daughter-in-law. She is carrying my grandchild. Both things matter. Neither thing gives her permission to erase my wife's studio. Her mother looked at my daughter-in-law then, just briefly. But I saw it. A flicker of uncertainty. Her father continued. From what I understand, she was trying to help you move forward. Did she tell you I specifically said that room was not to be touched? No one answered. Did she tell you my wife's unfinished painting was removed while I was out of town? Again, silence. I took a sip of coffee. Then perhaps you didn't drive 4 hours with the full story. My daughter-in-law's face tightened. Her father recovered quickly. Families share space. Things change. You can't keep a room frozen forever because of grief. You're right, I said. That surprised him. I can't keep it frozen forever, but I decide when it changes. I decide how it changes. And I especially decide whether my wife's belongings are removed from my house. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he tried the final card. So you're willing to put my pregnant daughter on the street? No, I said. I'm giving 2 adults 60 days to find housing after they spent more than 2 years not doing it. The kitchen went quiet. And if you're so concerned about where your daughter will live, I continued, why is your solution to pressure me instead of opening your own home? No one moved. Her father looked at his wife. His wife looked down at her mug. My daughter-in-law looked away first. That was when I knew the conversation was over. They had arrived expecting a guilty old man. What they found instead was the owner of the house they had all mistaken for common property. By the time they left an hour later, nobody had raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The answer had been given clearly enough. The restoration began 3 weeks before my son and daughter-in-law moved out. I know the exact timing because I marked it on my calendar. The same day, Patricia confirmed they had signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment 12 minutes away. The process started on a Tuesday morning when a small moving truck backed into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as workers unloaded canvas after canvas wrapped in protective blankets. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like watching pieces of Margaret come home. I stayed out of the garage while they worked. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, because some moments deserve privacy. The sounds carried through the house anyway. Furniture being shifted, shelves being reassembled, boxes being opened, voices calling measurements back and forth. For hours, the studio slowly rebuilt itself behind a closed door. Late that afternoon, my son knocked on the patio door where I was sitting outside. "It's done," he said quietly. I looked at him for a moment. He seemed older than he had a month earlier. Not physically, just different. Like someone who had finally stopped arguing with reality. "You should see it." I followed him into the garage. Then he stepped aside and let me enter alone. The room wasn't perfect. I noticed that immediately. The shelves sat a few inches off from where I remembered them. Some paintings were hanging in slightly different places. The mason jars holding Margaret's brushes had been arranged by color instead of size. Little details. Human details. But everything was there. The easel stood beside the north-facing window. The pegboard held her palette knives. The supply cart sat exactly where she had left it. And resting on the easel was the unfinished Cannon Beach painting. Someone had wrapped it carefully in brown paper for the move, and then returned it exactly where it belonged. I stood there without speaking. The afternoon light entered through the window just as Margaret always wanted. Soft, even, quiet. For a long time I simply looked around the room. Then I walked to the easel and carefully removed the protective paper. There it was. The sea stacks rising from the fog, the shoreline sketched in, the upper portion still unfinished, waiting. Just as she had left it. Something inside my chest loosened for the first time since October. Not healed, but loosened. Later that evening, my son joined me in the backyard. We sat in silence, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Eventually he spoke. "I didn't understand what that room meant." I nodded. "I know. I thought it was just a room. Most mistakes start that way." He stared at the grass for a while. "I'm sorry, Dad." This time the apology felt different. Not because the words were different, because the understanding behind them was. The next Saturday, they finished moving the last of their belongings out of the house. Before they left, I placed a sealed envelope on my son's pillow. There were things I still needed him to understand. Things too important to risk getting lost in another conversation. I left the letter on my son's pillow the night before he moved out. Then I got in my truck and drove for nearly an hour because I didn't want to be there when he read it. Some things are easier to understand when no one is standing in front of you waiting for a response. The letter wasn't angry. I'd spent too many years around construction sites to believe anger builds anything worth keeping. It simply said what needed to be said. I told him I loved him without conditions. I told him that it never changed and never would. I told him that what happened in the house wasn't entirely his fault, because I had allowed too many small compromises to become permanent. I had mistaken silence for patience, and patience for wisdom. Most importantly, I told him something I wish I had understood sooner. Being a father does not mean becoming invisible. Loving your family does not require surrendering every boundary you have. The next morning, they loaded the final boxes into a rented truck. My daughter-in-law was quieter than usual. Not cold, not defensive, just thoughtful. Pregnancy had softened some things, but I think reality had softened more. Before leaving, she walked into the garage one last time. I happened to be standing near the workbench when she came back out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked toward the studio door and said, "I never understood why that room mattered so much." I nodded. "I know." She hesitated. I should have asked. It wasn't a dramatic apology. There were no tears, no speeches, just a simple acknowledgement of the mistake that started everything. Sometimes that's enough. My son found me later by the driveway. The moving truck was running. The apartment keys were already in his pocket. He held the letter in one hand. "I read it 3 times, he said. "Good." He smiled faintly. "Mom would have handled all of this better than either of us." For the first time in months, I laughed. That's probably true. Then he hugged me. Not the quick, distracted hug people give at holidays. A real one. The kind that says more than words ever could. They drove away that afternoon. The house became quiet again. Not empty, just quiet. There is a difference. A few months later, my grandson was born. Healthy, loud, perfect. I stood at the hospital holding him while my son introduced me as Grandpa for the first time. My daughter-in-law smiled when she handed him to me. Not because everything had been forgotten, because some things had finally been understood. These days, I spend most mornings in the studio. Sometimes I sit in Margaret's chair and watch the light come through the north-facing window she loves so much. Sometimes I study the unfinished Cannon Beach painting and wonder what she would have done with the fog above the sea stacks. I still don't know if I'll ever finish it. Maybe it isn't mine to finish. Maybe some things are meant to remain unfinished. A reminder that love doesn't end when a person is gone. One quiet morning, nearly a year after they moved out, I opened the studio window and listened to the wind moving through the trees. The room was exactly where it belonged. So was my family. And for the first time since Margaret died, the quiet didn't feel like something that had been done to me. It felt like something I had finally reclaimed.